ES Audio.
From the Evening Standard in London, I'm John Weeks, and this is The Leader. April the 22nd, 1993. 18-year-old Stephen Lawrence is waiting for a bus in Eltham, southeast London, when he's assaulted and killed in a racist attack by 6 white teenagers he didn't know. Today, 30 years since that fatal attack, only 2 of his killers have faced justice, and 3 years after the investigation became inactive, the Met Police has named a new major suspect, Matthew White, who died aged 50 in 2021. The lead identifying him was investigated 2 decades after it was passed to the Met's homicide team, all because of an error about who gave them the information. On LBC, Metropolitan Police Assistant Commissioner Matt Twist apologised for the failings in the investigation.
So it's awful, isn't it? We know the impact of the racist murder of Stephen Lawrence, and the subsequent inquiries continue to be felt throughout policing, and one can only think of his family at this moment in time. Unfortunately, too many mistakes were made in the initial investigation. We know that, and the impact of them continues to be felt. It's recently been the 30th anniversary, and the Commissioner, Sir Mark Rowley, apologised for our failings, and I will do so again.
He wouldn't be drawn on whether the case would become active again. Joining me now to run us through the details of the Met investigation is our crime reporter, John Dunne. So, John, there is a long series of events that have led to this new suspect. Can you explain why it's taken 2 decades for the Met Police to chase this lead?
Yes, I'm afraid this is another sorry part of the tale of the investigation into the murder of Stephen Lawrence. Now we're more than 30 years on from the event in 1993, and a suspect has now been named publicly for the first time, a new suspect, in inverted commas. His name is Matthew White. At the beginning of the investigation into the Stephen Lawrence murder, this Matthew White was on the police radar. It was suggested to them that he had been at the house of one of the other suspects on the night of the murder, and witnesses had put him at the scene. In what capacity, that's not clear, but more than one witness said he was there at the time of the fatal stabbing. Now, police had his name. They interviewed him, and he was not named because he wasn't arrested. He was questioned, and police have subsequently, all this time on, more than 30 years, they have named him following a fresh investigation which has thrown his name up along with surveillance footage of him from times after the murder.
And I understand he was actually interviewed on a couple of occasions, 2 or 3. Why was that, and what sort of came out of those interviews?
He was arrested having been put at the scene by witnesses, but he denied any connection with the crime. A key part to this name coming up is the fact that a relative of his had contacted a policeman sometime after the murder and said that that relative, a male, had information that White had admitted being there at the scene. Now, that information, for whatever reason, the detective who initially had that information wasn't part of the investigation, but he passed it on to the relevant team, which they followed up. But at the time, recent times after the murder, they didn't manage to get hold of the right relative and therefore didn't get the information. Some years later, they found the right relative, but the information that they gleaned was still not enough to bring a prosecution.
And do we know any more about Matthew White himself? Are there any more details being released about him?
Matthew White lived in Eltham and was known to be, an associate of some of those prosecuted in connection with the crime. He went on his life unravelled. He became addicted to hard drugs. He was a heroin addict at the end of his life, I understand. Died only age 50. He also had a criminal record. In 2020, relatively recently, he assaulted and harassed a shopkeeper on the same road where Stephen Lawrence was stabbed all those years ago. He was convicted, and he was said to be threatening the shopkeeper, who was a black male, saying, "You're going to get Stephen Lawrenced," after this shopkeeper accused him of shoplifting. So he had a criminal record, and apart from having a few jobs here and there, he worked as a gardener at one stage and in the building trade, but he died in a bedsit and was a known drug addict.
And I understand 4 former Met police officers are being investigated for potentially committing criminal misconduct. What do we know about that?
Yes, the Independent Office for Police Conduct announced in 2020, following an investigation which was started in 2014, that they have submitted a file to the Crown Prosecution Service, CPS, to consider whether 4 former officers who are in senior roles during the early stages of the investigation, the possibility that they have committed criminal offences of misconduct in public office. As stated before, it was a very controversial start to the inquiry, and the inquiry, an investigation into the way that the inquiry was dealt with at the beginning, resulted in the Macpherson report, which was heavily critical of the police and said that they were institutionally racist. So these individuals are being investigated for perhaps lacking in vigour in their investigation in the early part of the inquiry into Stephen Lawrence's death.
Let's take a break now. In part 2, our Home Affairs editor Martin Bentham discusses how this latest admission of failings will impact the Met's reputation.
No, I think this case will remain a stain on the Met's reputation forever, really.
Joining me now is the Evening Standard's Home Affairs editor Martin Bentham. So Martin, when you look at the details of the case, the investigation around the murder of Stephen Lawrence, the number of times Matthew White was interviewed, it's a complicated series of events to follow. When you consider the initial error and all the subsequent interviews that the Met had with him, how does that look for the Met?
Well, clearly, as with a lot of the Stephen Lawrence investigation, all that's emerged with it, a lot of it doesn't look very good. Clearly, in this case, he was arrested eventually, but opportunities to arrest him and potentially bring him to justice were certainly missed early on. And clearly, he's never been brought to justice. He's now dead, so he's never going to be brought to justice. And at face value, the evidence before us today, which the Met has revealed following this BBC investigation, does indicate that there was a strong case to answer at the very least. So clearly that's very troubling, and it's the latest in a long line of very troubling revelations about what's happened with this investigation. Clearly, we all know, it's been well documented, that unfortunately it was blighted right from the start by racism, corruption, and so on, and then a series of subsequent errors in the investigation. But the truth of the matter is that although the Met sometimes is very good at going back and pursuing cold cases and can bring people to justice at the very long time after the event, if you've made a mess of the initial investigation, then that task is an awful lot harder and sometimes proves impossible, because you clearly lose the evidence that you might have had at the time to be able to bring somebody to justice. So, and as I say, in this case, he's dead anyway, so there's no possibility of it in his case, but clearly very, very troubling.
And following this news today, I mean, what are the criticisms that are being made about the Met surrounding this case?
I think the criticisms surrounding it are the same ones, aren't they? That in this case, there's been testimony from a relative that's apparently been, not for any malign reason, it appears, but simply wrongly entered on the police database. Therefore, the relative was not interviewed until a long time after this initial report was made. That the relative saying that White had been present at the scene of the attack. His description or his appearance matched that of the person that Dwayne Brooks had seen, and described Dwayne Brooks, the friend of Stephen Lawrence, who witnessed the whole thing. And so, so clearly that in itself was in effect an administrative error, but one with very serious consequences. And then there are other problems that have emerged of just an apparent lack of determination, according to one of the people involved, Clive Driscoll, a former detective involved in the case, suggestions that he was deterred from pursuing the case and told not to, in essence, not to bother pursuing it at a later stage when he'd had some of this material. So I don't know the truth of that, and that's an allegation which we haven't had a proper response to as yet. But clearly the Met has admitted that it made too many mistakes in its own admission in the case, and what's emerged today just illustrates further the problems that have blighted this investigation and still led to only 2 people being convicted of Stephen's murder, when clearly the trial judge in the conviction of those 2, Gary Dobson and David Norris, said there were probably 3 or 4 other people at large who were responsible. So we know that there are other people who were responsible, who should have been brought to justice. 3 other people have been named, of course, and now Matthew White is the 4th one to be named, in addition to the 2 who've been convicted. And yet, clearly, while that situation remains, it's very unsatisfactory for every single person, actually, to see people who've carried out something so heinous remaining at liberty, never being brought to justice for it, and particularly so, obviously, for the friends and family of Stephen Lawrence.
And obviously this is the sort of latest blow for the Met Police after a bit of a tough couple of years in terms of their reputation. But can the Met claw back some kudos, as it were, from this case if they do come to a sort of definitive decision over White and a almost sort of posthumous conviction?
Well, I don't think there's any way of doing that, frankly. You can't achieve a posthumous conviction. You can say you believe that person was responsible. I think they've clearly put cases to the CPS about him on 2 occasions, and they have decided that there was no realistic prospect of a conviction. So I think that particular avenue is closed to them. No, I think this case will remain a stain on the Met's reputation forever, really, because even if there was belatedly to gain some convictions of those others who are still alive, if they were able to do it, clearly it's been far too long in achieving that, and it again appears unlikely that they're ever going to be able to achieve that. So no, I think unfortunately it's what it isn't today. It's a stain on the Met's reputation. Unfortunately, several such cases where things have not been done correctly and people have got away with serious crimes. Doesn't happen too often, but it does happen, and some of them have been particularly notorious. And this, the highest of them all, I suppose, from that point of view. But no realistic prospect of any great credit coming to the Met from this case in the future. If the Met wants to take anything from this case, what it needs to take forward is to deliver what everybody involved in that case would have wanted, which is to ensure that the racist attitude which definitely blighted the Stephen Lawrence inquiry do not blight further inquiries, further investigation, and the handling of policing in London in general.
There's more news, interviews and analysis in the Evening Standard newspaper and at standard.co.uk. That's The Leader. Thanks for listening. We're back tomorrow afternoon at 4 o'clock.